Hey students, my name is Rusty Prejean, and this is my wife, Angelina Prejean, and she is going to be teaching with me today as we are going to be jumping into week 2 of our series, Atypical. And if you're not familiar with the word atypical, it basically means unique or not so normal. And in this series, we're talking about some not so normal families in the Bible and our own not so normal families too.
Last week, Pastor Gary talked about how no matter what kind of family you come from, no family is typical or normal, and no family is too simple or too complex. Every family is atypical or unique in its own way, including yours.
But here's a question we have for y'all. What if God is calling your family to be even more atypical than it already is?
Yeah, every family has imperfections, problems, and struggles, but typical families either try to handle them their own way or never handle them at all. But atypical families, on the other hand, invite God into their imperfections, problems, and struggles.
And your family can be used by God to do atypical things in the world. The question now is, how?
So my family kind of fell out of going to church, and I had no clue how to convince them to join me. I tried asking, that didn't work. I tried to subtly drop hints to them, and that didn't work. Everything I tried did not work. When I finally gave all of my problems to God and asked Him to give them peace and comfort in joining me at church, things started looking up. My mom would attend with me, and she actually even started volunteering on Sundays. And I just kept praying for the Lord to stir up something in my brother and dad. And you know what happened? My brother ended up interning at Parkway last summer. With my dad, though, I just kept praying, and then this whole pandemic happened. And it was truly a blessing in disguise for my family, because now my dad watches the service online with my mom and my brother every week, and my parents go on for a long walk afterwards and discuss what Pastor Mike and Pastor Adam preached about that day. And then when I tried using my own ways, nothing changed. But when I began to go to God and ask God for help, change happened in my family. And at some point, every family experiences difficulty or conflict, and you might be experiencing one of those situations right now.
Yeah, typical families might try to handle those situations on their own, or just ignore the problems and hope they go away. But atypical families know they can't handle them on their own. Atypical families ask for God's help. Last week, you got to meet the family of Adam and Eve, the world's very first family. We saw how their story went from very wrong as a result of their choices to disobey God and hurt each other. But because God is a God of grace, God used their family to do something amazing, to one day bring Jesus into this world.
And today, we want to introduce you to another family. This family lived many generations after Adam and Eve, and they were very atypical in their own ways. You may have heard a lot about Abraham before. He's an important person in the history of our faith because of an important promise God made to him. Let's take a look at Abraham's life to learn more about it, specifically his relationship with his nephew Lot. So let's look at Genesis 13, 1 through 3. It says, Abraham went from Egypt to Negev, he, his wife, and all he had, and Lot with him. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. He went by stages from Negev to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been formed, to the site where he built the altar, and Abram called on the name of the Lord there. Now Lot, who was traveling with Abram, also had flocks, herds, and tents, but the land was unable to support them as long as they stayed together, for they had so many possessions that they could not stay together. And there was a quarreling between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were still living in the land. So Abram said to Lot, please, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, since we are relative. Isn't this whole land before you separate from me? If you go to the left, I will go to the right, and if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Lot looked out and saw the entire plain of Jordan as far as Zoar, and was well watered everywhere, just like the Lord's garden and the land of Egypt. So Lot chose the entire plain of Jordan for himself. Then Lot journeyed eastward, and they separated from each other. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, but Lot lived in the cities on the plain and set up his tent near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were evil, sinning immensely against the Lord.
So Abraham and Lot moved to completely different cities. Going on into chapter 18, we see some new developments. In Genesis 18, we have God telling Abraham that he is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because of their great sin against him. The only problem with this was Sodom was where Lot lived. In verse 22, when Abraham learned God was going to destroy Sodom, the city where Lot lived, Abraham made a choice to confront God. In verse 22, when Abraham learned God was going to destroy Sodom, the city where Lot lived, Abraham made a choice to confront God. Now in Genesis 18:22-26, it says this. It says, "The men turned from there and went towards Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Abraham stepped forward and said, 'Will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away instead of sparing the place for the sake of 50 righteous people who are in it? You could not possibly do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating righteous and the wicked alike. You could not possibly do that. Won't the judge of all the earth do what is just?' And in verse 26, it says this. The Lord said, 'If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake.'" So he pleaded with God on Lot's behalf. And in response to Abraham's prayer, here is what happened. In Genesis 19, verses 27-29, it says this. It says, "Early in the morning, Abraham went to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land of the plain, and he saw that smoke was going up from the land like the smoke of a furnace. So it was, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham and brought Lot out of the middle of the upheaval when he demolished the cities where Lot had lived." Abraham was able to go into Sodom and save Lot from being destroyed in God's judgment. Now, this is significant because last week we said that if you want God to use your family to do atypical things, sometimes you have to be the first person in your family to do something atypical. That's what Abraham did.
And when you're fighting with someone in your family, it isn't typical to do what Abraham did. The typical response is to fight back, hold a grudge, or give the silent treatment. But Abraham chose to do the atypical thing. He prayed for Lot in the middle of their conflict, and he didn't wait for an apology. He reached out first through prayer. And this might seem so simple, but it's so atypical. Not so typical families pray for each other. Just like Abraham saw prayer change his family for the better, and I saw prayer change for the better in my family, prayer can change for your family for the better too.
Every family has imperfections, problems, and struggles, but atypical families invite God into those situations through prayer. And prayer doesn't have to be complicated. It could be as simple as thanking God for your family, even if you're not sure you mean it at that moment.
Or maybe even asking God to give you love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control.
It could be asking God to give you wisdom to resolve your disagreement.
Maybe it's just asking God to do the same for the family member that you're fighting with, or just thanking God for helping your family.
Now try this. Think right now about a recent disagreement you had with a family member or a disagreement you seem to have often. Now imagine how that conflict could be transformed if you stopped to pray instead of fight. How do you think prayer could change your attitude, temper, or perspective? Do you think prayer could change the person's attitude you're fighting with? What if prayer could begin to change your family's pattern of behavior in the long term?
It's interesting that Abraham chose to pray for Lot before they ever reconciled. In the middle of their conflict, Abraham went first by choosing to pray for Lot instead of continuing to fight with him. So this week, what if you decided to go first? Before we end today, I want to leave you with this challenge. Right now, I want y'all to try this out. If you have a piece of paper, a note card, or maybe you can just type it in the notes section on your app. But I want you to stop right now and write down that name of the family member you are having the most conflict with. And then, right now, set a reminder on your phone or place the card somewhere where you will remember to pray for that person whenever you have that conflict with them.
You see, when disagreements happen, typical families scream, they fight, they hold grudges, and struggle to find a common ground. But not so typical families pray for each other. So if you commit to praying for your family more than you fight with them, imagine how God might be able to use your family to do atypical things in this world. So let's start now by closing this message out in prayer. God, thank you so much for your love. Thank you so much for all the things that you do for us. Right now, I also want to thank you for what you've brought to us today in this word, by allowing us to be able to look at Abraham and Lot's relationship and how they handled things and the way you moved in that, and how this message, even though it's thousands of years old and it happened thousands of years ago, it can still be relatable to us today in the way that we interact with our families. So God, I pray that each and every student, each and every person who's watching this right now will be able to take that step that Angelina talked about and to think of that one person, to think of that one individual that they can begin to pray for. The one person in their family they can begin praying for and pray for healing in that relationship, God. We love you. We praise you. We thank you in your precious holy name. Amen.